I've always wanted to make a year-end top 5 or top 10 list of something. But given that my output is rather slow and inconsistent, I usually don't have enough entries to make it worthwhile. What's the point of making a top 5 list if I've barely played enough games to populate one? Well, this year I managed to get through a total of 30 games. I definitely had a few candidates to choose from, so I felt why the hell not. There was only one problem though, I don't put scores on my reviews. The reason for that is fairly straightforward, I just don't find the score useful. I don't believe that I can condense all my thoughts down into a numeric rating. I just can't quantify my enjoyment of something like that. And I think scores mostly serve to give others something to complain and bicker about whenever a score doesn't reflect whatever they believe said score should be. I'd much rather have people engage with my arguments and observations directly instead of attacking a number. But a lack of a score made an easy ranking a bit more difficult. To get around that problem, I employed a simple solution. I made a grid of all the titles I've played and simply compared each title to every other title. I just decided off the cuff whatever title of any given two I was comparing I liked better. That left me with a bunch of rows of pluses and minuses that I aggregated into a final number, where each plus makes the number bigger and each minus makes it smaller. So here's my overall ratings distribution. Yeah, I'm not going to bother dragging this out needlessly to have you watch the entire video. If you don't want to hear what I have to say, you can just pause the video here, look at the ranking, and then get on with your life. Before you do that though, I have an honorable mention here. The reason for that is simple, I didn't get far enough into this particular game where I felt a full review would be justified. I usually try to either get through a game entirely or at the very least experience enough of it to ensure that the review resulting from it would still be interesting and useful even if I haven't seen the ending. Technically this game would rank below the bottom 5, given that I simply couldn't give enough of a shit to play it for more than 3 hours, but on the other hand, this was mostly just due to one very poorly designed aspect of the game. Had that aspect not been so terrible, I think I would have actually enjoyed the rest of the game. My honorable mention as a bad game that I've played in 2021 is Hyperdimension Neptunia Rebirth 1. Now, given that this game is a JRPG, I knew going into it that there would be some grind to be had, because that simply comes with the territory. But the downright excessive amount of grind I've encountered here quickly became unbearable. I mostly followed the critical path of the narrative and got all the way to one of the bosses in Chapter 2. Only this boss absolutely wiped the floor with me. It was such a large disparity between that fight and the preceding fights against other mobs that it was clear that I was doing something wrong. To get a sense of what I should be doing instead, I looked up some advice from other players, which basically boiled down to go and grind enemies. Fair enough, it's a JRPG after all, but what made me quit the game almost immediately after that was when I saw how much grind these other players recommended. My characters at the time were around level 7 or 8 after 3 hours of playing, and the advice I got for beating the Chapter 2 bosses was to grind until my characters reached anywhere between level 15 and 25. Did this game really expect me to grind out more than twice the levels I already had? Yeah, fuck no. My time is more valuable than beating the same 4 or 5 enemies over and over again. And since your time is also more valuable than that, let's get on with the actual top and bottom 5 games that I've reviewed this year. Number 5 on my list of least liked games goes to Cultist Simulator. While I enjoyed the Lovecraftian setting and themes of the game and felt that it had some pretty decent writing, I unfortunately couldn't get past the incessant trial and error gameplay. Like I said in my full review, I understand that a large point of the game is exploration and discovery. After all, that's what a lot of Lovecraft's writings also were about, explorers who tapped into something they didn't or couldn't understand, or if they could, drove them to madness as a result of said insight. And that's usually a big plus for any video game. Exploration is one of the driving motivators in a lot of video games, and it's fun discovering stuff developers put in their games. But a certain baseline understanding of the game, its mechanics and goals still needs to be communicated, at least to me. As such, I didn't like how the game was content with letting me waste my time on endlessly circling around while achieving nothing, or having my run end without fully knowing why. I think what really soured me on this game a lot was the apparent pride the developers took in pointing out that the game had no tutorial, as if that were a point in its favor. It tells of a very skewed perception of how to treat your players if not telling them how to play your damn game is a point of pride. I've heard a lot of good things about the Yakuza series and wanted to get into it for a long time, but I've read and heard everywhere that the games can be fairly dense in story, and I didn't want to start in the middle of the series without having played the first games to get a sense for the story and setting. Fortunately, Yakuza 0 came out a few years ago as a prequel to the entire thing that proved to be the perfect place to start off. Yakuza 0 is a delightfully Japanese game, filled with quirky characters and very entertaining quests and plot lines. It manages to bounce between hilarious silliness and heart-tugging drama effortlessly. It's far from perfect, and I'd suggest ignoring a lot of the minigames you can find there, because they can drag out the runtime of the game excessively to the point where the pacing of the narrative starts to suffer. But if you stick to the critical path and look out for all the neat little side quests, it's well worth it. As I've alluded to in my review of PC Building Simulator, every task can be turned into a simulator. The question you have to answer before you do, however, is if it should be. And building PCs clearly shouldn't. While the attention to detail in PC Building Simulator with the inclusion of a massive number of licensed real-world hardware parts is impressive, the actual core gameplay loop is poorly thought out, offers little to no challenge, and crucially doesn't properly introduce a topic as dense and complex as consumer-grade computer hardware to any newcomers. In the end, much like many quote-unquote simulator games out there, PC Building Simulator feels more like a one-off joke rather than something that should be released as a commercial game with oodles of corporate licensed DLC. If you want to build a PC, just do it yourself in real life. My love for city building games goes back decades at this point, but there were always one or two things that made me lose interest in these games after a while, and that's either a complete lack of challenge and narrative where the game ends up in a holding pattern and basically plays itself, or if there's some kind of hard limit somewhere, like a resource that can completely run out, thus forcing you to stop playing if you don't want to see your city fall into ruin. Frostpunk transcends all these issues by having both a compelling narrative and a meaty challenge. It's the first city building game I've played that tries to ask moral questions and actually has them mean something in the context of the gameplay. Too often, a moral choice is just a means to split up abilities that are otherwise equivalent. But Frostpunk makes the morality mean something, in the sense that an immoral action makes the game easier without the game judging you for it. You have to judge yourself, and that's infinitely more potent than having a game waggle its finger at you and telling you that you've lost some karma. It truly raises the bar for the entire genre, and anything coming after it can't be judged without taking into account what Frostpunk excels at. It feels weird putting something as simplistic as Receiver on a bottom 5 list. Surely a game as basic as this isn't even worth putting on a ranked list, right? I understand what the goal here was. It's a proof of concept to explore realistic gun handling mechanics that most other games massively simplify in order to streamline the gameplay. And I like the ambition of implementing mechanics to manually load bullets into magazines, to manually load those magazines into the gun, etc. But there has to be something else there. You can't just build a few largely empty bits of level that randomly get stitched together and populated with equally randomized enemies and call it a day. Especially not if you want to sell said product. There's just not enough effort on display here for me to consider recommending the purchase of Receiver, and because of its limited scope, I just didn't find the core gameplay of realistic gun handling all that entertaining. Mastering the gun mechanics is mostly just done for its own sake, not because you need to master it to participate in an interesting narrative or explore a rich world. Return of the Obra Dinn is the kind of unique game you can stumble upon in the wide sea of samey titles that mostly just go through the motions, and effortlessly shows how a single developer can outmaneuver giant AAA development studios by just focusing on interesting and novel game design ideas instead of chasing the latest battle royale trend rendered in the world's most expensive golden pixels. Lucas Pope once again manages to make bureaucracy fascinating by giving an insurance agent a magic pocket watch that lets them see the dying moments of the crew and passengers of a ship in order to deduce what happened on board and how each of the victims has found their respective demise. It's one of those rare puzzle games that makes you feel smart for solving it, without ever getting so frustrating or obtuse that you don't know where to go next. The only downside is that the deductive nature means that there's little to no replay value, since it really is just about figuring out who died in what way. But Return of the Obra Dinn makes up for that by just being so damn good that it doesn't matter if you only get to fully experience all its facets just once. Quite a few games in my bottom 5 have in common that they feel like they just consist of a basic concept brought to life with minimal effort to be made into a sellable product with little thought invested on how to actually flesh out the game in question. And the same is true for Roundabout. Roundabout is a game of two distinct halves that barely interact with each other. The main gameplay is a simplistic arcade-style test of skill that gets old fairly quickly. It doesn't pose much of a challenge, and the quote-unquote humoristic nature of driving around a spinning limo really isn't as funny as the developers might have hoped for. What also isn't funny are the B-movie FMV sequences between missions. I've already outlined in my review why I generally don't like this type of too cool for school filmmaking, but to quickly summarize, schlock has to happen organically. You simply cannot be enjoyable B-movie schlock on purpose, because what makes it enjoyable B-movie schlock in the first place is that it was intended to be genuinely good, but either a lack of talent or skill or whatever meant that it ended up being terrible. Roundabout's FMV sequences are bad on purpose, and you know what they say, bad on purpose is still bad, and Roundabout is a bad game. I admit that my partiality towards this game is entirely because of nostalgia. I've already mentioned it in my lengthy retrospective, but I believe that no other gaming franchise has shaped me as a person more than the Tony Hawk games. But you know what? I've played few nostalgia-bait games that have managed to hit the sweet spot as effectively as this game has. It's exactly what I wanted out of a remake of the first two games. Classic skateboarding gameplay perfected with the implementation of a few tricks and abilities from the later games, with levels rendered in an absolutely gorgeous art style. If my primitive teenage mind from the early 2000s could have envisioned what the pixelated, low-poly mess that were the original games were supposed to look like in high fidelity, this remake has captured it perfectly. I said it in my review of this game, and I'll say it again. If you haven't played any of the other games and want to know why this series was such a big deal back in the day, play this remake. What else could have topped my worst list other than Frank Herbert's Dune? I mean, I clearly did this to myself. I sought out a game that history doesn't remember in the slightest, and for good reason. It's one of the thousands of licensed tie-in games that used to litter the bargain bins. The gameplay is shoddy, the narrative, world and themes of the Dune franchise are utterly wasted, it's an ugly game to look at, and I'm eternally grateful that it took less than 3 hours to get through. Honestly, the less said about it at this point, the better. It's just an outright horrible game. Not only is Deathloop my favorite game I've played this year, it's also the only game I've bought and played that was released this year. I've already explained why I usually only play older games in my review of Deathloop, and why this particular game was one of the very few massive exceptions to my rule. And outside of a few technical inadequacies that really shouldn't happen, I enjoyed my time with Deathloop immensely. It's not a perfect game, it suffers from a weak narrative and an overall underutilized setting, but it absolutely has it where it counts, and that's the gameplay. I constantly mention my love for immersive sims in general and Arcane's other games in particular, so it was already a given that I'd really enjoy Deathloop even if it was just more of the same. It's just a shame that I can't outright call it an unequivocal masterpiece because of the aforementioned weaknesses, but I still had a supremely enjoyable time with Deathloop. Thank you very much for watching. What were your favorite games you've played this year? Let me know in the comments and give me some suggestions on what to cover next year. I know it's been quite a year for all of us, and we deserve to find a bit of distraction in video games. I hope I can continue making videos at a decent pace next year, so maybe I can do a top 5 again once it's over, hopefully under less strenuous circumstances. Anyway, I wish you all happy holidays and hope to see you again next year.